What's up, guys? Welcome to the Red Chip Poker Podcast. The topic of this episode is small blind leaks. We're going to be considering my top 5 leaks for the average player when playing out of the small blind. Just based on sheer probability, you are going to be affected by a number of these leaks, more than likely. So if you are interested in improving your small blind win rate, this episode is for you. First of all, why do we care about the small blind? Firstly, it's the largest source of losses after the big blind. So the big blind is our most losing position at the table, but it's closely followed by small blind. Winning players typically have a small blind win rate, or you could refer to it as loss rate, of minus 15 BB per 100 hands when playing out of the small blind, although it is possible to improve on that. There are winning players who have win rates as high as minus 8 big blinds per 100 hands in the small blind over a large sample. Virtually no one has a positive win rate in the small blind. It's simply too difficult to overcome that advantage of being forced to post an entire small blind without first knowing what our whole cards are. As a result, small blind also has a big impact on red line. So although red line or non-showdown winnings is not super important, it's mostly our overall winnings that we care about. If you are interested in generating a higher red line, the small blind is a very logical place to look because it's going to be the largest source of red line losses after the big blind. So let's get into our top 5 leaks. So in first position, it's lack of small blind completes. Now, you might be surprised that this is actually at the top of our list because it may be something that you haven't really thought about before, or you don't even necessarily think should be part of your strategy. Many players are looking to simply play raise or fold from the small blind and don't even think about small blind completes. There's still a number of players out there that think that small blind completing is the same as limping from other positions, and it's something that only recreational players do. We know that theoretically we should be completing the small blind. When it's folded around to us unopened, we should have a completing range according to Solver. It's not necessarily a very wide completing range. It could be somewhere in the region of 10 to 15%, but it really does depend heavily on the tree. Sometimes it will be less than that. The point is there is a non-zero small blind completing range according to Solver output. Now that's the theory version, but in practice, small blind completing is significantly more valuable than GTO says that it should be. A simple example is just to consider how aggressively big blind will ISO raise versus a small blind complete compared to how often they're supposed to be ISO raising in practice. According to GTO, big blind is supposed to ISO raise close to 40% of the time when facing a small blind complete. According to pool data, the population only raises 27% of the time on average. That means when we complete in the small blind, we get to see a flop far more often than we're supposed to. It boosts the EV of small blind completes relative to what a solver says the EV should be. The other interesting dynamic here is that the population folds too often to a flop lead. So assuming big blind doesn't ISO and simply checks back against the small blind complete, the average big blind is folding the flop way too often, certainly above 50%, but sometimes above 60%. This leads us to certain scenarios where completing any 2 cards from the small blind with the intention to fire the flop can sometimes be plus EV. And that's even if we assume that we never hit any flop ever and will always give up if our flop lead gets called. So for example, we can complete 7 deuce offsuit in the small blind with the intention of betting every flop, and even if we give up after that, it can end up being plus EV against many opponents. We do want to consider the type of opponent in the big blind. It's probably not a good idea to complete 7 deuce offsuit against an aggressive reg, for example, but if our opponent is not ISOing and falling far too often against a flop lead, any 2 cards can be profitable. And of course, 7 deuce offsuit doesn't always miss the flop. It can sometimes make 2 pair, trips, quads, etc. So that's going to help us some of the time also. We'll actually have a legitimate hand. Another point of interest regarding small blind complete is it's a great technique for ISOing versus fish. We all know the importance of ISO raising, for example. So if we see a fish limp in under the gun, we understand the importance of ISO raising on the button, for example. The reason is we get to play a heads up pot against a recreational player, and that's where a decent amount of our profits are going to come from. Same applies in the small blind complete scenario. It's a great opportunity for us to play additional heads up pots against recreational opponents. Imagine a situation, for example, where it's folded around to us in the small blind, we have Jack 4 offsuit, we have a look in the big blind, we see our opponent is a recreational player who is making lots of mistakes post-flop. Now, in most cases, it doesn't make sense to open raise something like Jack 4 offsuit from the small blind unless our opponent in the big blind is overfolding versus opens. We simply don't want to build a pot with a hand that trashy. However, that doesn't necessarily mean we want to fold, because if we fold, we're sacrificing a very valuable or potentially valuable situation to play a heads-up pot against a recreational opponent. So which option does that leave? It leaves the small blind complete as a very logical option. So if you currently don't small blind complete or only small blind complete very rarely, at the very least, look out for opportunities to increase the number of pots you play against recreational players by incorporating a small blind completing range. But realistically, it's a good option even versus regs, because the average reg simply doesn't ISO enough big blind versus small blind complete. Okay, let's move on to leak number 2, which is ignoring the cold call option. This is a very prevalent leak in today's games. Many players actually believe that it's incorrect to have a cold calling option when in the small blind. They've been conditioned to think that the correct way to play out of the small blind when facing an open is either to 3-bet or to fold. This is a very limiting perspective, especially when you consider the implications of facing a small open raise. You see, if our opponent makes a large open raise and we decide to play 3-bet only, i.e. 3-bet or fold, it's not necessarily that big of a problem, but when we see what the solver does against smaller opens, it becomes more of a problem. Here's an example. If button min raises, according to solved preflop ranges, this particular tree had 0 rake. Small blind is supposed to be cold calling 14.1% of the time against a button min raise. That's not a negligible calling range. It's very difficult to justify simplifying this strategy into a 3-bet only strategy when the cold calling range is such a pronounced part of the original strategy. Another example from the same rake list tree, UTG min raises. According to solver, we should have 12.6% cold call from the small blind. Again, that's non-negligible. That's a very pronounced part of the strategy. Now, it's true if we incorporate rake, the cold calling frequency is going to drop by a few percent, but it still exists. And it's also true that if we cause the opener to use a larger sizing, once again, the cold call frequency is going to drop from the small blind. But it doesn't disappear completely. In other words, small blind cold calling is a theoretically correct part of poker strategy. I would say that it's virtually impossible to be getting the best of it by arbitrarily ignoring any option to cold call. Besides, aside from just theory, there are some exploitative reasons why cold calling makes sense. I'd like to give you one simple example. Imagine a hand that's close to the edge of the theoretically correct 3-bet range according to solver. And usually we'll find these same hands are mixed across both cold calls and 3-bets according to the solver. Now, solver says the EV of this marginal 3-bet hand is the same whether we 3-bet or whether we cold call. But the EV of the 3-bet is based on our opponent having a certain fold to 3-bet frequency. In other words, solver says, okay, so the EV of cold calling and 3-betting here is the same, but we're assuming that villain is folding 60% of the time when facing a 3-bet in this scenario, for example. But we have a look at our opponent's HUD stats, and he has 30% fold to 3-bet on average. In other words, he's not someone that folds to a 3-bet very often, yet the EV that's calculated by the solver assumes that he's folding 60% of the time to a 3-bet. It's very logical to deduce that the EV of one of the weakest hands in our range is going to drop significantly if our opponent is not folding as frequently as the solver thinks that he should be. So what ends up happening? The EV of 3-betting goes down. Very likely the EV of cold calling stays the same. In other words, it's a flat up. In other words, it's a straight up mistake to be 3-betting in that spot. Solver's assuming a certain amount of fold equity pre-flop. We don't have that. According to our opponent's HUD stats, all of a sudden 3-betting can become a losing play. Another example of a common issue here is that players think that they have to 3-bet because if they don't 3-bet from the small blind, then big blind's going to squeeze them every time. It's true that we want to be aware of aggressive squeezes from the big blind, but in reality, not all big blinds are squeezing aggressively, and the ones that are squeezing hyper aggressively may be vulnerable to back raises. So a back raise is when we cold call out of the small blind, big blind squeezes, we then hit the big blind with a 4-bet. It's called a back raise because we've already taken a passive option earlier on that same street and are now electing to take an aggressive option. So there's this mentality that we can't defend against squeezes. If we get squeezed, that's the end of it. That's why we have to 3-bet from the small blind to avoid being squeezed at all costs. But that's not the end of the game tree. We still have options when facing a squeeze. So another reason why we don't want to arbitrarily ignore the cold call option in the small blind. Let's move on to leak number 3. Leak number 3 is lack of big blind awareness in the RFI situation. What we mean to say here is that when it's folded around to us in the small blind, many players are simply following a static strategy. Simple example is they have their 40% RFI range from the small blind. They just open that no matter what. Doesn't matter if it's a fish or a reg. It doesn't matter what their fold to still frequency is, what their 3-bet frequency is. Players have their 40% RFI range from the small blind. They just use that no matter what. Let's consider some simple examples of aspects of our opponent's tendencies that we need to be aware of. The first is to look out for automatic profit steal spots. If we have a HUD running, we want to know our opponent's big blind fold to small blind steal. Even if we're playing in a live environment, we want to have a rough idea of how often our opponent is folding the big blind when facing a small blind steal. As a rough guide, if our opponent is folding more than 60% of the time to a small blind steal, we should be open raising any 2 cards. If our opponent is folding more than 50% of the time to a small blind steal, then we should be increasing our aggression on the steal attempt, although we might not be open raising any 2 cards. Imagine, for example, we have an opponent who's folding 65% of the time to a steal, but then the small blind elects to simply just open his regular 40% RFI range from the small blind. He's missing out. It's a leak. He has an exploitative opportunity, but he's not capitalizing on that opportunity. Another scenario to be aware of, which is off most players' radars, as we've discussed earlier in this podcast episode, is the any 2 complete spot. It's a very good idea to have data on how often big blind raises against a small blind complete and how often big blind folds to a flop lead if he checks back when facing a small blind complete pre-flop. Because based on those 2 numbers, there are scenarios where we should be limping any 2 cards. And when we say any 2, what we really mean is any 2 cards that are outside of the standard RFI range from the small blind. So we could have a setup where we still raise 40% of hands or so from the small blind, whereas the remaining 60% of holdings we put in our small blind complete range. Obviously, that's a very wide range. It's going to include all of the trashy holdings, 7 deuce offsuit, 3 deuce offsuit. But the point is, it's an auto profit spot. We can make automatic profit by virtue of the fact that we complete pre-flop, we see a flop far more often than we should, then our opponent folds far more often than he should when facing the flop lead. So it's very similar to an any 2 raise spot, but it's an any 2 complete spot combined with flop lead. Many players just aren't aware of this. Imagine now we have an opponent who is raising the big blind too aggressively against a small blind complete. The average player is actually raising too passively in this scenario, too infrequently, but every so often you're going to run into a reg who has a hyper aggressive big blind ISO versus small blind complete frequency. Think 50% or above. What do we do in that situation? Well, now our opponent's raising too aggressively, which means they are vulnerable to the complete raise trap. The idea is, if our opponent has above 50% big blind ISO versus small blind complete, we shouldn't even necessarily be raising pocket aces. It does, of course, depend on how aggressively they are 3-betting, because it might still be worth open raising pocket aces if they are 3-betting hyper aggressively as well. But let's just assume a player with a fairly normal 3-bet stat, but a hyper aggro big blind ISO versus small blind complete. There's no reason to open raise pocket aces in that scenario, because by completing pocket aces, we're going to get action 50 to 60% of the time if we assume that's how often our opponent is ISO raising. The next stat we might look at is how often does our opponent fold to a complete raise. Bear in mind, many players don't even have this stat on their HUD. It's just not on their radar, but it's something that you should have on your HUD. If our opponent ISO raises the big blind against a small blind complete, how often will he fold to a complete raise, aka a 3-bet in that scenario? And it's going to go one of two ways. You're either going to get someone who is going to raise a lot from the big blind, but then fold a lot to the complete raise. Guess what? We have a good opportunity for the complete raise bluff. Or you're going to get an opponent that doesn't really fold very often to the 3-bet, despite having that hyper aggro big blind ISO range to begin with. In which case, they're going to be vulnerable for the complete raise trap, where we complete our premiums with the intention of 3-betting when our opponent ISOs. That means we get to funnel more chips into the pot when we have a premium holding. Okay, leak number 4, lack of big blind awareness when facing an open. So this is really thinking about the players behind us when making a decision in the small blind. Now, it's also important to be aware of the opener. We've touched on that briefly already. So our opponent raises first in, want to think about how often he's folding to a 3-bet, because it might be the weakest hands in a theoretically correct 3-bet range are no longer plus EV because of our opponent's low fold to 3-bet stat. We also just generally want to appraise the caliber of the open raiser. Is he a reg? Is he a fish? If he's a fish, we can defend wider. If he's a reg, we might decide to defend a slightly tighter range than theory would suggest. So we definitely want to think about the RFI player, but we also want to think about villain behind. So that's going to be the big blind in this case. Now, players are completely paranoid about being squeezed off their small blind cold call. And that's even in scenarios when big blind doesn't squeeze. So a typical reg is going to have something in the order of 7 to 8% average squeeze across all positions. So if we're thinking about whether we can cold call in the small blind, but our opponent has a 3 to 4% squeeze stat, then we really do not need to worry about being squeezed off a small blind cold call. Because if our opponent does squeeze, he just has it anyway. Now, generally speaking, if our opponent is squeezing hyper aggressively, that can sometimes be a reason not to cold call too wide in the small blind. But as we mentioned earlier in this podcast episode, it's important to keep in mind that if our opponent is squeezing hyper aggressively, there may be some counter-exploitative opportunities that we can utilize in that scenario. It's not the end of the game tree just because we got squeezed. We're able to back raise. We could, for example, check our opponent's fold to 4-bet after squeeze stat and see if it's exploitably high. If it's above about 58% of the time, then we actually have an any 2 cards back raise versus squeeze. That could actually be very profitable. Besides, part of the irony here is that even if we do 3-bet aggressively from the small blind, that doesn't mean we shut down any action behind from the big blind. In the modern game, players are cold 4-betting much more aggressively than they used to, with fairly speculative hands in some cases. So is it better to be squeezed off a holding or cold 4-bet off a holding? Probably better to be squeezed off a holding because we've invested less before folding. Another scenario that's very useful to be aware of, and this is really one of the reasons why it hardly makes any sense for any player to have 0% cold call from the small blind. Even if someone describes themselves as a 3-bet only player from the small blind, they should still have a cold calling range in the small blind for exploitative reasons. And here's the scenario. I refer to this as the second big blind scenario. So this is button open raises. We're in the small blind. We look behind. The big blind is a huge nit. He doesn't get involved in any pots. He folds a lot. He doesn't really squeeze. If he does squeeze, he's probably just going to have kings or aces anyway. Now, if we think about how we play out of the big blind, we defend by cold calling really wide in the big blind because we get a discount on our call. We've made that mandatory 1 big blind investment and we're closing the action pre-flop. Now we're in the small blind, but it almost functions as a second big blind because the actual big blind is very unlikely to enter the pot. We've got a discount on our pre-flop cold call. We've already invested that small blind and we're very likely closing the action. Or we can say we are effectively closing the action, even though every so often the big blind might wake up with a premium and get involved. So although the small blind's never going to be as good as a big blind defense scenario, hopefully we can see some of the similarities there. there are going to be a decent number of opportunities to cold call fairly wide from the small blind based on the fact that the big blind's not getting involved in the action. Okay, let's think about leak number 5 from the small blind. And this is arbitrary 3-bet aggression. It's this mentality that we just have to 3-bet from the small blind no matter what. We have to find as many situations to play aggressively from the small blind as we can. This is how a lot of regs are currently thinking about small blind play. Problem is, we end up in a situation we can describe as forced 3-bet aggression. The other trend is towards using large 3-bet sizings no matter what, because at some point players have gotten the idea that the EV of large 3-bets is higher. It's interesting, we are one step ahead of that now in terms of context, because we have solver models where several different 3-bet sizings are made available to the solver. And the interesting finding is that the solver actually mixes between several 3-bet sizings. So although it likes large 3-bet sizings, it also makes use of smaller 3-bet sizings as well. So it's not even necessarily theoretically correct just to be hammering a large 3-bet sizing. But players have got it into their head, they need to 3-bet like crazy from the small blind, and they have to use really large 3-bet sizings. Do you know what one of the interesting side effects of that is? Small blind is now the most overfolded spot when facing 4-bets. So if we think about this from the perspective of a player on the button, when we face a 3-bet from the small blind, that is the best scenario against the pool to run a 4-bet bluff. It might be the case that we think about 4-bet strategies being roughly the same when we get 3-bet from the blinds. So if we open the button, it doesn't matter too much if the small blind 3-bets or the big blind 3-bets, we should have a roughly similar approach to 4-betting against those two positions. Actually, it's kind of quite different. Small blind is a great opportunity for 4-bet bluff, whereas 4-betting against the big blind, less so. That's because the average player is forcing themselves to 3-bet very aggressively from the small blind, but they're not doing the same in the big blind. The average player is actually not really 3-betting the big blind enough. There's a significant gap between the average player's small blind 3-bet stat and big blind 3-bet stat. Very aggressive in the small blind, maybe a little bit on the passive side when constructing their big blind 3-bet range. One of the problems here, and we've touched on this already, is that certain fringe holdings in a theoretically correct 3-bet range may no longer continue to be plus EV if a certain amount of fold equity is assumed by the solver, but in practice, villain is simply not folding that much against 3-bets. So certain hands that the solver says we can 3-bet actually may end up being directly minus EV unless we have some kind of significant post-flop edge against our opponents. Players often find themselves in difficult 3-bet pot situations. Think about the logic of forcing ourselves to 3-bet hyper-aggressively for large sizings if we're not also very skilled at playing lots of 3-bet pots out of position with marginal holdings. And this is the situation that players are putting themselves in, is a 3-betting with a very wide range, and they're a little bit lost when they get into the 3-bet pot post-flop. It's not logical to assume that this is still increasing their EV. They're constantly investing large amounts of chips into a scenario that they don't really know how to play very well or feel uncomfortable in. It's not logical to think that that's going to be positive for their win rate. You know, another interesting side effect is that the float bet on the flop in 3-bet pots works significantly more often against a small blind check OOP in a 3-bet pot relative to a big blind check OOP in a 3-bet pot. So we can feel more comfortable about float betting the flop wide when specifically playing against a small blind opponent. So we can see the average player is really forcing themselves into a large number of post-flop situations that they don't really understand how to navigate. All right, so as a quick recap, this was especially for players looking to improve their small blind play. Might be good to go through each of these 5 areas again, perhaps fire open your tracker at the same time, see if you can spot some of these small blind leaks in your own game. This was Coach Weasel, and this was the Red Chip Poker Podcast.